Our next speaker is my colleague Corinne de Vries. Corinne is head of our translational science and soon to be the EMA liaison at the US FDA. You're going to talk about gender equality, women's health, a forgotten priority. You and I have sometimes talked about we did all this legislation back in the 60s due to the thalidomide catastrophe, and the only subpopulation that haven't benefited from this is actually the females and the pregnant females. And those were the ones we wanted to. Have you been overprotecting them? The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Stefan. Okay, this is easy. I can do this. Thank you very much, Stefan, also for giving some airtime for this topic, which of course will be, what I will be presenting is results of work of 30 years at this agency, but also beyond and together with stakeholders. And actually not just the agency, the fact that this work has been possible is because of also the relentless support of committee members, rapporteurs, committee chairs. I'm looking at one particular. So it is a tremendous honor that I can be here and present some of this work. So gender equality goes beyond pregnancy, women's health. There is a lot of evidence out there that there is no gender equality. Women are, on average, they live 5 years longer than men. But the healthy lifetime that they have longer is only 4 months. And so there's work from OECD, Eurostat, World Economic Forum that shows that's because they have longer chronic diseases. There is a diagnostic and treatment delay, and that's because they have less money and they spend more time looking after the men in their lives. And so as an agency, we get questions about this. So is it true that for EMA, women are the forgotten priority? Oh. Sorry, there was a copyrighted slide in there, I think. For EMA, they can't be the forgotten priority because the clinical trials regulation dictates that the clinical trial population needs to represent the anticipated user population. And so women have to be included in clinical trials if they are going to be impacted by the disease. So what I'll start with is present you with some data on the inclusion of women in clinical trials. And I start with the first slide, which comes from data from EudraCT, which was a trials repository before CETIS, which was presented by Maria earlier. And what you see is, it's not an error here. 90% of trials include both men and women. 4.8% include women only, 5.2% include, 4.8 include men only, 5.2% include women only. And the tiny bar on the right, and then an invisible bar on the further right, is the pregnant and breastfeeding women in clinical trials. So that's the total, but does that mean if you have 90% of trials include men and women, does it mean that, okay, but these trials have 80% men and 20% women? That's not the case. So women are actually, overall, this is a slide, you can't see it, but what you see on the y-axis is the proportion of women represented in clinical trials per disease areas. This is a study carried out in 2007 by colleagues from EMA and the network. Really demonstrated that there is overall appropriate representation of women and men in clinical trials with some slight differences. Overrepresentation of women on arthritis, rheumatoid arthritis, and on allergic conjunctivitis. Slight underrepresentation of diabetes and hepatitis B and hypertension. But when the authors then looked at sex-treatment interaction, it didn't actually result in clinically meaningful results to the extent that it required labeling or dosage changes, different dosages for men and women. that's the clinical trials. Then they also carried out a literature review, and we have done further analysis since this publication from 2007 to keep checking whether this is the representation of women is appropriate. And what this shows is that actually, yes, there is some biased inclusion to some extent, but most of it is not clinically meaningful. And when it is clinically meaningful, it does result in differences in labeling. And we're totally transparent about it. So you can find this information in the EPAR, you can find it in the SMPC. But that doesn't mean that there are no underrepresented population in clinical trials. And so there is an IHI project currently, has just recently started, that really looks into more overarching inclusion, fair inclusion, appropriate inclusion of all population in clinical trials, not just men and women, but different social and ethnic groups and so on. So we're really looking forward to seeing how that work progresses. The other thing is that, and I'm so happy that Thomas gave his presentation, because the other thing is that what is also true, that is treatment responses and treatment pathways sometimes differ between men and women, and that's also the case in animals. And so it may be the case that if you start only on male rats and a pharmacological product is not effective, it never gets developed any further because it might be effective in women, but we wouldn't know. So there is some areas of question there, but yeah, that is something for us to bear in mind. Now, the other thing is that, so the clinical trials information system really helps us because it'll enable, it gives us the opportunity to keep this kind of analysis going forward, but also it means that we're completely transparent about what clinical trials are ongoing throughout Europe, and it means that people have a searchable database that enables patient enrollment. So if a clinician or a patient wants to know, is there a trial currently ongoing that might benefit this particular patient, then there is a way of searching for that. And Guido, you mentioned transparency, and Maria, you mentioned Acte-EU. And with one of the priorities in the network, in the regulatory network strategy, being equitable access to medicines and also clinical trials. Now, Acte-EU, this accelerating clinical trials in Europe, benefits from multi-stakeholder interaction. We have 43 different groups of stakeholders who we really interrogate and ask what should be the priorities. And equitable access has been identified, but women as underrepresentation in clinical trial has not in any of the discussions been identified as an issue. Now, the nice thing about the CITES system is that if people want access, like I said, you can find it, and you can even do it with the clinical trials map. So now I go towards what Stefan alluded to earlier. The big group that is missing in these clinical trials is pregnant and breastfeeding women. Now, why is that the case? And Stefan, you mentioned thalidomide. And I ask you to just ponder this for a minute. In a clinical trial, you give an experimental treatment to patients, you randomize the treatment, and then you evaluate the analysis, the results of this experiment after. And so the question I want to pose to you is it okay to experiment on pregnant women or on breastfeeding women? And generally, when you ask this question, the immediate response is, of course not. How dare you suggest it? But there's actually a delayed response that, well, actually, there may be occasions where this is appropriate, or it might be appropriate. And so there are 5 million babies born in Europe every year, and 90% of women use some form of medication during pregnancy, which has not been tested mostly in a formal clinical trial setting. Now, that includes things like antacids, folic acid, and so on. But 25% of women use a medicine for chronic diseases, such as epilepsy, asthma, diabetes, and so on. And so what we're doing in the agency, so when we say we don't want to experiment on pregnant women, here are some of the examples that have really shaped our thinking. There are products that have been developed, given for indications, considered what the product is considered necessary, and now we're scared because some of those have really had detrimental impact on the baby. So we go, oh no, we don't want to experiment because you don't know yet what's going to happen. But when you do that, when you think like that, you're actually blinding yourself to the fact that there are diseases that are also detrimental during pregnancy, that have a really detrimental impact on pregnancy if not treated. So for example, diabetes, if left untreated, gives bad impact on the child, whereas when you control the blood sugar levels, then those impacts, the risk of those impacts disappear, or they certainly reduce. And so what we're finding is that in trials of some of the diseases that are detrimental in pregnancy, even despite the fact that currently we have contraceptive requirements, despite those requirements, people fall pregnant occasionally. Sometimes because they thought they were infertile, because their disease is incompatible with pregnancy and results in early loss. So when this happens, automatically, these women are then excluded from the trial and taken off the treatment. And patients ask us to change that. They really wish to stay on the treatment, accept the uncertainty that comes with that treatment and the impact on the child, and say, this is my choice. And so then my question to the rest of the world is who are we as regulators to say that they know they need to go back to their standard of care, which was not effective or which is teratogenic. And so I'd like to suggest that we need to find a different balance. So we need to find better ways of balancing the needs for treatment with the uncertainties that come with that treatment about the risk. And so one of the paradigms that we use is we say a healthy child starts with a healthy mother. And the narrative has been that we exclude pregnant individuals from clinical trials because we want to be cautious. But you're not automatically being cautious because the novel treatment may be better than the current standard of care. And well, all the things I've already said. So then my question is, at the moment, what we're doing is we're allowing these products to be used in pregnant and breastfeeding women in a not experimental setting. So the question is it better to experiment in a way in an uncontrolled setting? Because that's what we're doing. So I want to quote Theodore Roosevelt, who says, reach for the stars, but keep your eyes on the ground. So how can we be ambitious, but have scientific and data-driven ambitions going forward? And we have developed at the agency a strategy for strengthening the benefit-risk information throughout the product life cycle. And so I want to start with the post-authorization. So this is specific to pregnancy. So post-authorization is currently what we're focusing on when it comes to evaluating the impact of medicine use in pregnancy and breastfeeding. And so we have a ton of guidelines. We've developed methodological guidance for people who investigate in this area. We have guidelines for industry. And we have tried to develop strengthened signal detection methods. And so what we find is that pregnancy registries, when we ask them of industry, they have difficulty to recruit, they have lost to follow-up, they don't have comparator groups, and as a result, they don't result in fast impact on the labeling. Similarly, post-authorization epidemiology studies, very few make it into labeling. Medics, clinicians, are very good at signal detection, and the signals that we've seen in pregnancy come from the literature. Uterovigilance, our signal detection system, hasn't resulted in signals in pregnancy. We ask companies for periodic safety update reports on their product, how is it used, what are the side effects globally, and so on. We receive very limited data on pregnancy. And the data on breastfeeding is even thinner. So, are we doing the right thing? So, can we change this experimental setting? Is it appropriate to do more in the clinical trial space? Can we generate some more robust evidence in a controlled setting of a clinical trial, carefully monitored, carefully balanced as to when you are more permissive? And that is actually what we've been working with with industry, regulators globally over the last two or 3 years. And that has resulted in a draft guideline from ICH, E21, that really, where we've tried to say, okay, with the ambition to be science-driven, responsible, not cavalier, how and when can we be more permissive for to include pregnant and breastfeeding individuals in clinical trials, so that it benefits women and who are pregnant or breastfeeding and want to know, can I take this treatment, or how should I, time it in terms of breastfeeding and so on. That is out for public consultation until the 15th of September, and I implore you, we really want to receive your feedback. Let us know what you think. Are we being off our trolley? Have we missed something? What further guidance would you need? And so on. So we really look forward to that. Now I'm going to, oh no, I'm not going to time out yet. What about older medicines? Because basically this is all clinical trials. That's the medicines that are coming onto the market now. But most of the medicines used in pregnancy have been on the market for decades. So it's not even one pharmaceutical company that we can ask for the data. Because these products are off patent, it is quite challenging to get data from others. And you also, I wish to really implore you that unless a product is contraindicated in the label, the minute it's authorized for use in adults, it is authorized for use in pregnancy and breastfeeding, even if the label may say, well, only if the benefits outweigh the risk, talk to your doctor, and so on. So we have an EU framework contract that really enables us to generate data where needed, both in terms of translational sciences along the lines of what we've heard from the previous speaker, and in terms of epidemiology. And you see some logos on the left of the infrastructure generated in conception, built in the COVID studies, and now in studies that really look at the feasibility of when can you and can't you use these epidemiology data for generating robust evidence, because we need to do that with caution. We don't want to create false scares, and we don't want to create a false sense of security. And then I'm going to zoom out to the global picture, away from pregnancy only. And okay, what does this mean for helping better equality in medicines for all women? And so we cannot do this in isolation. Like Maria said earlier, we cannot sit in our ivory tower, because we only see the dossiers that are submitted to us, and we don't see the products that were not developed because they don't benefit the right proportion of the population, or we haven't identified the benefits for women. So the clinical trial system at the moment gives us structured protocol data, and the studies haven't been completed yet because it was started in 22. Going forward, it will give us the results data, and that will give us the opportunity to really monitor continuously whether the inclusion of women and other groups is appropriate. We have Trials Map, so that people really help enable inclusion for all. There is Darwin and the epidemiology studies that I mentioned earlier that really gives us the infrastructure and opportunity to evaluate utilization and safety aspects of medicines throughout Europe. So we can also keep monitoring and work with our stakeholders where action is required if groups are disadvantaged. So as I said, we cannot do this in isolation, especially when you look at smaller populations, such as pregnant or breastfeeding people. To get the data, we need to be global and not Europe only. Medicines development is happening globally. So if we as Europe only have certain demands, that doesn't help. We need to agree with our counterparts in other regions. So we can evaluate the data. We need to work together with our stakeholders to help progress this field. And then hopefully the next anniversary, well, not the next, like the 5 years, but in 30 years, the story will be women and men live for equally long time, and there is, the treatment delay is the same and hopefully negligible because we have AI to do it all for us. And with that, I'd like to thank everybody again for all the work that you're doing on this, that I now get to present. And yeah, thank you very much for your attention.
Many thanks, Corinne. Would you be open to a question? Yeah, there are already questions here. I think, you know, turning 30, then you are at least a grown-up person. And what you showed here is actually, for me, a grown-up reflection and decision-making. Yeah. So I think it shows that the European regulatory system is a grown-up system, maybe even a mature system. So, but anyway, there are some questions here for you.
Thank you. So considering, I won't read it out, I mean. Well, what have we missed as regulators? I'd like to think that we are now aware of this and we're not missing anything as regulators because we're working on it, right? So we have got the framework contracts in place, we have got the Darwin system in place, we have got CETIS and the clinical trials map in place, so that going forward, we will do better. And if in the feasibility studies, we can demonstrate that with the infrastructure in place, we can do comparative studies of, for example, anticonvulsants or antidepressants in pregnancy, where at the moment, if you are pregnant and you have major depressive disorder, there is no medicine for which we know this is safe. So you have to choose to take a medicine with other therapy, or not have the medicine, with the risk, of course, that if you have major depressive disorder, that you have a suicide attempt, which in women is usually with an overdose of medicines. So which one do you then take? We don't know. And if we can demonstrate that we have the systems in place to do comparative studies, then my plea to the powers that be at this agency, and I have a listening ear, so I'm hopeful that this continues, is that we should be doing that kind of work. So we should, if it is feasible, because we don't want to be creating false alarms, if it's feasible, we should do the comparative effectiveness and safety studies to help patients. Because from my time in academia, I know that charities won't fund it, because they fund the work to support the affected children and the affected mothers, and they say this is for industry to do. Industry doesn't do it because they have a mandate for their own product and they don't wish to compare their products with the other ones, especially in this sensitive space. So this is for me an opportunity where we as regulators can step up in a responsible fashion. If it's not possible with the existing systems, then we need to think again.
Many thanks, Corinne. I think we will leave it by this, and thank you once again for presenting.